Welcome. My name is Tracy Reinhardt. I'm a library director and archivist at the Fond du Lac County Historical Society. And today I'm going to talk about Doc Aubery, the newsboy of the Iron Brigade. Doc has a tenuous connection to Fond du Lac County. He just simply attached himself to General Bragg during the Civil War. So that's how he is connected to Fond du Lac County. We're going to first talk about Doc and his early life, where he came from. And then, as a 13-year-old, he ran away to follow his brothers in the Civil War. So we're going to talk about his Civil War so-called adventure that he went on as a small boy. And then some of his Civil War memorabilia. We will be showing you some of that and some of his collection and some of the things that we've learned about his collection. First, we're going to talk about Doc's early life, because it is kind of amazing just when you stop to think of where he came from. First of all, his full name is Doc Bullard Aubery. His family gave him, for unknown reasons, gave him the nickname Doc when he was quite young. People mistakenly think he was a doctor, but he wasn't. He was just called Doc from an early age. He was born on the 1st of April in 1845 in Burlington, Vermont. He was the 12th of 13 children that were born to Albert and Elmira Blish Aubery. Now, Blish might be a familiar name because some of his distant cousins actually settled in Fond du Lac also. His family nicknamed him Doc, and that name just stuck everywhere he went, but he never was any kind of a medical doctor. His father's name was Albert Aubery, and his father was a carpenter, and many of his older brothers were also carpenters. But in 1860, when his father and his two oldest brothers decided to head to California to seek their fortune in the booming California era after the gold rush. But unfortunately, within a year of arriving in California, both his father and one of his oldest brothers died under what is just undetermined circumstances. I cannot find anything about the cause of their deaths, why they died suddenly, but right from the start, Doc, as a young child, was without a father. His mother, Elmira Blish Aubery, and her youngest daughter decided at the end of the Civil War to move out to California to stay with the one surviving brother who had remained in California. Unfortunately, tragedy struck again when his mother and his sister boarded their first ship to California in the St. Lawrence River, and that ship hit a rock, sunk, and both his mother and his sister then were drowned in this accident. So he had by the time he turned 18 and the end of the Civil War, Doc was already orphaned and did not have parents or several of his siblings. When the Civil War started and people were asked to enlist, Doc had his 4 remaining brothers at home in Burlington. All 4 of those brothers enlisted, and Doc got to watch them parade around town. His brothers were William, Cornelius, Harvey, and James. Now, William was a hospital steward during the war, but he only served for 6 months. He was discharged probably because of illness, because it says due to a disability. And William actually died 5 years later of some unknown lung ailment, probably tuberculosis or something of that nature. Cornelius is one of those rare brothers who actually went through the entire war, survived the entire war, served all the years because he enlisted at the very beginning. Harvey Aubery served for only 1 year before dying of disease in Philadelphia. And James I cannot find any record of him in Vermont enlisting, although it said all four brothers went together. But I did find that he re-enlisted in Milwaukee in 1864. And Milwaukee is where he settled after the war. But when he retired, he moved to California, where I believe some of his children had settled. When his brothers enlisted, the first thing that they did is they had to have a little training. They marched around town, learned to march in formation. So Doc got to watch them while they were doing all their drilling in Vermont. When it came time for the troop train to send them to New York, everyone from the town of Burlington was at the depot ready to send them all off on their trip, and including Doc. Doc would have been there with his mothers and his sisters, sending off those four brothers. But at the last minute, as the train was about to depart, Doc just had this idea, I think I'm gonna go along. So he snuck onto the train. He hid from his brothers. He didn't want them to know that he was actually on the train. In fact, some of the other soldiers helped to hide him from his brothers, because if they had found him, they actually would have stopped the train and put him off and sent him back home. All went well till they got pretty close to New York. And then that's when his brothers discovered him on the troop train. So they quickly, when they arrived, sent a dispatch, sent a telegram to his mother, so, telling her, Doc is on the train, but don't worry. Now, that's kind of how can you tell a mother, don't worry, your 13-year-old is on the train running after his brothers going to war? Doc himself writes about this a little bit, because he says when they got to New York, there was an uncle there to greet the four brothers, not knowing there were five of them. And so he took them to his house, and he took Doc under his wing, discovered Doc was barefoot, because it was summer, the end of June. So he went and outfitted Doc, got him some clothes, got him some socks and some shoes, intending the next day, of course, to send Doc back home to his mother. But the next morning, when the troop train left New York for Washington, D.C., Doc was on the train. And he wrote himself, they found out they couldn't get rid of me. So the lieutenant who was in charge of the company that his brothers had enlisted in actually took Doc under his wing, hired Doc, paid him $2 a week to keep his tent organized, keep his boots shined, do all the little housekeeping things. So Doc, even though he was not allowed to enlist because he was too young and too small for his age, actually was more or less a camp follower and under the employ of this lieutenant of the Vermont regiment. So now begins Doc's great Civil War adventure, although I don't know if living through the Civil War could be really called an adventure. Doc was a very astute little kid and had a great memory and told a lot of stories. Some of the first stories, some of the first things that really impacted him when he was first starting on this little adventure was the first thing that happened to him. We arrived in Washington. We went into camp in the rear of the Capitol building on what is known as Capitol Hill. We remained until the first part of July when the order of break camp was issued. And so then they marched, they went over the bridge, and they ended up in Alexandria, Virginia. Now, what happened in Alexandria, I did not realize until I started researching a little deeper. This was really a venerated place by those soldiers, because it was here on the 29th of May that Colonel Elmer Ellsworth was shot and killed for pulling down a rebel flag on the Marshall House. And a Marshall House was like a boarding house, rooming house where people could gather. And so Doc relates that anybody, all who could get from the ranks, meaning if they could get a pass to get away, they would go to this Marshall House, and it kind of was venerated as the place where the very, very first soldier, the first Union soldier, was actually killed. That really started the battle between the Confederate and the Union. Doc himself, because he wasn't a soldier, he was free to come and go as he pleased. So Doc himself went to that house. He says he went upstairs to the roof and saw the staff from which the old flag had been hung. And actually it was the owner, the proprietor of the Marshall House, when this Colonel Ellsworth had pulled the flag down and was coming down the stairs, it's the owner of the house who was a Confederate sympathizer who actually shot and killed this colonel. One of the other things that Doc remembered that really made a terrible impression was he also went and says he went to King Street. Another attraction I distinctly remember was that of a slave pen that he saw there, where the slaves were bought for auction. I never shall forget the sign on the front, which read, "Price, Birch and Company, dealers in slaves." It looked more like a hog pen. And in fact, a clean Vermont farmer would not place his own stock in a place, in that kind of a pen. It was so poorly. What we have here is a picture of Marshall House. This is where this Colonel Ellsworth was shot and killed. It is a spot where Doc actually went and visited, got his first taste of Civil War activities. Actually, Colonel Ellsworth was a personal friend of Abraham Lincoln. They actually went to law school together. And so his wake was actually held in the White House because he was a friend of Lincoln. And so that's one of the very first stories Doc learned about the Civil War. The first battle that he was connected to was the first battle at Bull Run. There were two battles at Bull Run. The first battle at Bull Run happened and started when Doc was off filling the canteen for his lieutenant who had hired him. And the lieutenant had found him a horse so he could travel by horse. He went and found a stream and was filling up the canteens, and he got separated from the company because of the battle that was going on. And this first battle, the Confederate overran the Union armies and repelled them. So it took Doc, he had to take quite a long detour to try and find his company because, as I'll tell you later, as he says later, he was a coward and he always headed for the back, the furthest place from any sign of battle. While he was trying to find his company, he happened to go by this old stone church. And he remarks that the steps were piled high with arms and legs of the wounded that had been amputated, obviously. And that made quite an impression on him also. The other impression he got was he noticed that there wasn't any food being dispensed from the commissary. The only thing that commissary was dispensing right then were shots of whiskey. While he's searching for his Vermont company, this is the first time he also has an encounter with men from Wisconsin. He probably started up a little talk looking for his company because this Wisconsin regiment was always positioned very close to his Vermont regiment that he was in. And so at the time when he was talking to these guys from Wisconsin trying to find his company, that's when a soldier came up to him, stuck a rifle in his chin and said, "Give me your horse." So he immediately lost his horse. And then later on, he had to join with the other Wisconsin soldiers as they were heading to retreating into the adjoining woods because they were being overrun by the Confederacy at this first Battle of Bull Run. The outcome of this battle ends up that his lieutenant was wounded during this battle and in the hospital, so Doc is suddenly out of a job. He doesn't have anybody to work for. So in his meanderings, he found another horse, and that's when also he realized that finding newspapers was a little bit of a lucrative job that he could do. He made friends with these Wisconsin soldiers, and he started peddling newspapers to them and ended up attaching himself to General Bragg from Fond du Lac because he had to find somebody new to work for as a camp follower. And he also discovered that those Wisconsin guys liked to read their newspaper a lot. And that's how he came to every little city that they would come to. He would go and get newspapers and bring them back to camp and then sell them to the soldiers, because that's the only way the soldiers knew what was going on in the overall war picture. Also at this time, when he's attaching himself to General Bragg, he discovered how the Iron Brigade actually got its name. And he relates this story that he says was told to him by General McClellan himself. During the Battle of South Mountain, General McClellan had his headquarters situated so he could see all aspects of the battle, all the different companies that were engaged in the fight. And so when General Hooker came in to report to General McClellan, McClellan asked him, who are those troops that are up there fighting on the pike or the main road, the main bridge at Bull Run, or at this battle, not at Bull Run? So he was given the reply, those are General Gibbon's brigades of Western men. So I guess Wisconsin and Michigan were west. That was part of the Wild West at the time of the Civil War, I guess. So McClellan made his famous statement, they must be made of iron, because that company held their grounds where no other companies were able to hold their grounds in the battle. So Hooker replied to McClellan, they are iron. If you had seen them at Bull Run as I did, you'd know them to be iron. So McClellan replied, they fight equal to the best troops in the world. And General Hooker was so astonished by what he took to be a really great compliment that he mounted his horse and took off without even getting his orders for what he was to do the rest of the day. And after the battle, from then on, McClellan always referred to those men as the Iron Brigade. So McClellan is the one in his official reports to his commanders, always referred to that group as the Iron Brigade, because that brigade would hold their ground where nobody else could. And of course, as a result of this, and they adapted and adopted this new nickname of Iron Brigade, some of the men right away had to create poems and create tributes to their new name. And I found one that Doc often referred to, and it goes like this. Hail, old Iron Brigade, whose deeds of war once echoed through the land we love so well, whose valorous deeds on many a field of gore, the music of history on many a page will tell. The other regiments that were part of the Iron Brigade also had individual nicknames. The one that Doc talked about the most is the 2nd Wisconsin. They were called the Ragged Asticles, more from the fact that when the contractors had run short of good materials when they made the pants for that regiment, and so they always were baggy pants. Supposedly, the contractor allowed enough fabric for the men to store a flag of truce in their backsides. So they had the baggiest pants ever, and that's how they ended up getting their name. And there even was a story that Doc told about when a general was there to review the troops, he ended up parking behind this regiment, and his young daughter quipped up, "Pa, wouldn't it be just as well if our carriage stood in front of the regiment?" Because she didn't like to see the backside and all these baggy pants. The 7th Wisconsin was known as the Huckleberries. The 6th was known as the Calico 6th. The 24th Michigan were known for some reason as the Featherbeds. And the 19th Indiana, which was the last company to be part of the Iron Brigade, were called the Babies. Not because they were whining babies, but because they were new to the Iron Brigade and hadn't seen as much battle as the rest of the companies. Battery B was called the 40 Thieves. And I wish I knew why they got their name, probably because the battery took much longer to move from place to place and had to improvise to get all of their equipment, their cannons and everything. And so they had to scavenge a lot for their own supplies. And I would guess that's how they got their name. Right after the first Battle of Bull Run, the Army was camped at Arlington Heights for the winter. They wintered over, and that's when Doc, at one point, had to travel about 30 miles to pick up his supply of newspapers to distribute to the troops. And as he was coming back with his newspapers, he did not know that the picket lines had moved. So he comes upon a picket line, and of course the sentry asked him for his pass, where his papers were, and he pulled out his pass that gave him the permission to travel during that time. And then the corporal or whoever it was that was reading his papers got a big grin on his face. And Doc says afterwards, "That's when I knew I made a big mistake, because even though they had blue coats on, they were Confederate. They were a Confederate sentry, and Doc knew he was now a prisoner of war." Doc really talks a little bit. He doesn't mention his time in the prisoner of war camp very much at all. But he says, "I stuck by McClellan's army during the campaign of '62 and kept up his newspaper business. On November 10th, '62, I left camp for Washington to get my supply of papers. It was 31 miles to Washington, and Jeb Stuart's Black Horse Rebel Cavalry was making things interesting in that region of the country. I got my supplies, left Washington, and on the morning of November 11th, during my absence, the Army started on the move. So about noon, November 12th, as he was leaving New Baltimore, supposing I would soon be within the Union lines, but instead, I was soon a prisoner of war, and the rebels confiscated my horse and supplies." What he doesn't mention here is he tried to bargain his way out when he was first with the sentries there. One of the other little objects that he had picked up privately for one of the other commanders was another commander had given him money to bring him back 6 bottles of whiskey. So he first tried to bargain his way out of being captured by saying, "I'm not a soldier, I'm just bringing newspapers." And when they didn't go along with that, he tried to buy his way out with the 6 bottles of whiskey, which they also just confiscated, but they kept him as a prisoner of war, so he couldn't get out of going to prison. He talks a little bit about this. He even has pictures, sketches drawn up, what he says are what he looked like before and after his time in Libby prison. But it's meant to make him look a little bit more haggard, but he was still a young kid, 13, 14 years old. One of his first acquaintances, he talks about, "One of my first acquaintances while a prisoner was Horace Baker of the 12th Massachusetts Regiment, also a prisoner. Next day, we, with about 50 other prisoners, were marched to Gordonsville, where we were placed in freight cars and shipped to Richmond and placed in Libby Prison. So that was his first inkling of actually being a prisoner of war, when all he was a camp follower. When he finally gets to prison camp, one of the first things that they're asked is if they have anything on them, any money, any valuables, they had to turn them in. And the person that he was talking to was this Major Thomas Turner. And Doc at the time had $380 on him, which was at that time a phenomenal amount of money, until he explains that his brothers had, he had 4 brothers in service, they had pulled together, and they were, as long as Doc was going into town, he was to go and send that money to their mother. So he had $380 on him. But when he went to pick up his papers, the Western Union office was closed. And so he was unable to send the money off. So he still had it on him when he was captured. And so he had to turn over this money to this Major Turner, who was the head of the prison. And Doc thought at the time he'd never see that money again, even though the Major promised him that when he was released, he'd get his money back. So Doc also says, I stuck to the Iron Brigade to the finish, was with it in all of its campaigning, and supplied it with newspapers to the best of my ability. Then he adds one very telling sentence. I was in Washington after papers when the war was closed, and I was in Ford's Theater the night that Lincoln was assassinated. Then I came to Wisconsin in the wake of the Iron Brigade regiments and have been here ever since. So this is the only mention that I've ever found where he admits and tells that he was in Ford's Theater the night that Lincoln was assassinated, but he doesn't talk about it at all anywhere else in all of his writings. So it must have been a pretty traumatic experience for him, something he just couldn't talk about because that would make him relive that event. Doc was a great storyteller, and he collected a lot of stories from others, but he also told the stories of things he remembered that he was part of. And one of the most frequent questions he was asked was, how does it feel to be in a war? And I really have to give Doc credit, because even as a youngster, he talks about being a coward, really. And he writes about it this way. I was in 2 battles where he was actually caught in the battle instead of being behind the lines. And I never fought in either. However, I know what it is like to be a coward. And I have seen many a hero. I always had a hankering, when there was any danger, to go to the rear. Yes, that impulse was uncontrollable. And I recall a laughable occurrence at Fredericksburg, Virginia. The enemy had a large number of siege guns there. Now and then, they would throw a tremendous shell across the Rappahannock River and send consternation and panic through the camp. At first, these shells created confusion and dismay, but very near little attention was paid to it. But then, while I was standing one day in the camp of the old Iron Brigade, a shell was heard coming through the air, and it whirled with a terrific crash directly over our heads. Every one of the soldiers crouched down. Some went behind the shelter tents in little blue heaps. So did I. And when I raised up, everybody was white and faces blanched. As soon as they saw the danger was past, they all seemed natural again, and some would laugh and joke over it. This is a great example, and Doc can joke about it now, but some people in severe times of stress will tell jokes to cover up the stress, to lighten the mood, to cover up their fear. And they made jokes afterwards about how can you hide behind a tent when a shell is coming in? The tent is not going to offer any protection whatsoever from that shell. So they laughed about the guys hiding behind a tent. After Bull Run, when on retreat and after losing my horse, I did get under fire. And there's where I proved a coward. When the 1st Virginia Battery, the Black Horse, swung around on the Pike Road and fired a volley at us, the zip-zip of their bullets was heard very plainly. I thought I was hit at first. A ball from one of their carbines, one of their guns, hit the dry bark of a tree, scattering the dirt and dust so that my eyes were completely blurred for a half an hour. So he got the residue off the bullet hitting the bark of a tree and couldn't see very well for a half an hour. It was then that I wished I had never gone to war. I would gladly dissolve the partnership between myself and Lieutenant Leach, for he and I were there to put down the rebellion. If I had met him there, I believe I would have quit then and there and told him I was an uncontrollable coward and wanted to go home to Vermont. So he admits he was really afraid of what was going on. One of the other stories that he did not participate in, but he collected stories, and it seems that everybody in all of the different areas of command, they knew Doc. And he was they all kind of looked out for him. Hey, he's only 13, he looks like he's only 10 years old. He's just a kid, a camp follower, but they're all looking after him. And he relates one of these stories that was told to him by Colonel Lucius Fairchild. Now, if that name doesn't ring a bell, you don't know Wisconsin history, because right after the Civil War, Lucius Fairchild became governor of the state of Wisconsin. But Lucius Fairchild told him a story of something that happened to him that Doc decided needed to be written down and retold. Fairchild was riding by the side of a Colonel O'Connor, who then commanded the regiment. And O'Connor asked Colonel Fairchild for a lead pencil, which he handed to him, a very, very short cedar pencil. And then O'Connor used it and then put it into his pocket. And very shortly afterwards, at the end of the day, they were attacked by the enemy, and Colonel O'Connor was killed. Now, during the war, something that you might not realize, most soldiers were buried where they fell, and that would have also happened to Colonel O'Connor. And the rest of the soldiers were still involved in the battle. And after the war was over, then different regiments, the Army would actually create cemeteries, national cemeteries, and these bodies were then dug up from where they were buried, where they fell, and reinterred in these national cemeteries that would usually be created near a battlefield. So Colonel O'Connor, after he was killed, was actually reinterred in one of these national cemeteries. But then Colonel Fairchild told that the Iron Brigade and some of the members of the company, they wanted to have the little colonel, as his pet name was, to be buried among his old comrades in arms, among the other members of his company. So Colonel Fairchild was part of a small squad of his regimental comrades who assisted in transferring him to the cemetery where the rest of the Iron Brigade who had fallen were buried. He said when they dug him up, very, very little remained of the colonel except his shoulder straps and one very small cedar lead pencil. So Colonel Fairchild then told Doc that I have it now. I still have that lead pencil. And he also still had the half-decayed shoulder straps that the colonel had worn. So that's another story about what happened during the war, after the war, and Doc collected those kind of stories if he wasn't telling them himself. So he's a lot of different stories to tell. He also tells about a different kind of battle. And this one is kind of a little bit unusual. You usually don't hear this kind, but this is another example of how some soldiers can tell jokes to relieve, it's a morbid sense of humor, but it's really meant to relieve stress or to keep the soldiers from getting too depressed after battle. An Army chaplain, Doc says, ran up against some of this kind of soldier's wit. One chaplain came to Colonel Bouck of the Iron Brigade with the remark that his men were very good Christians and lovers of the Lord. Why, only yesterday 7 of my men were baptized. So the colonel of the Iron Brigade just drew up his shoulders and with a squint of his eye called out to his adjutant, "Say, adjutant, deal 15 men for baptism early in the morning. I'll be darned if I'll have any regiment from New York beat the 2nd Wisconsin on that one." So that's another type of the humor that kept and continued through the war that Doc had to really record and write about. One of the other things that he just casually mentioned, and in one of his books, he has this illustration of President Lincoln reading a newspaper. And he says, one time when the Army was preparing for a review, President Lincoln would be there to review the troops. And they were in Fredericksburg. And Doc had just come back from picking up a supply of papers and was ready to distribute them. And they're all bound together in great big bundles. But Doc always carried a few loose papers for instant sales along the way. So as he was passing by the general's tent, his aide-de-camp came out and hailed Doc and said, "Here, boy, we need you, we want you." So of course, he rode up, got off his horse, and then was just told to give one of his papers to President Lincoln, which he then did. And then he mounted his horse and went on his way. So he actually personally delivered a newspaper to Lincoln. One of the other characters that he encountered is another story of some of the things that amused him. It was a story to amuse other people. And he said that when he would visit Washington, often to pick up his papers, there was quite a character there that could be found at the National Hotel. And he even knew this guy by name. Everybody knew Bo Hickman was a tramp, and they all joked he never did an hour's work. And when he had to tell a story, he would always charge people a quarter or whatever before he would tell them a story. He was always looking for ways to make money that he didn't have to expend any energy on. At one time, this character was determined to go to Baltimore, but he didn't have any funds. So he had this little plan where he actually got on the train, and the train left. And when the conductor came along, when he saw the conductor coming through the rail car to collect tickets, he would stick his head out the window. And then the conductor would tap him on the shoulder and say, "Hey, I need to get your ticket." And so this guy, as he pulled his head into the window, deliberately let his cap fly. And so then he had the excuse, oh, my ticket was in my hat and my hat just blew away. And so the conductor just let him take his ride. His ruse actually succeeded in the fact that he never had bought a ticket. And he told Doc that he used that several times to, whenever he needed to travel anywhere, he would actually use that rise where he'd lose it in his hat. There was another instance, and I've never heard of an instance like this, where there's a battle going on, and one of the locals would come and say, hey, I want to join the fight, even though he wasn't an enlisted man. And they told the story of this old guy named John Burns, came to the 7th Wisconsin and asked General Callis if that was his regiment, and can I fight in your regiment? And this guy had an old flintlock gun, must have been very old and not very fit for battle. And so he and the general argued for quite a bit about whether or not the general would allow him to fight. But finally, the general kind of gave in. Hey, every man is valuable if he wanted to be involved in a fight. But he gave this old John Burns gave him a newer gun because he didn't want him using the old flintlock. Wasn't sure it would even fire or if the guy could handle it. Gave him a cartridge belt, but the guy didn't even want the cartridge belt. He just took the ammunition and stuffed them in his pockets. That during the skirmishing, it really intensified, and the general found himself kind of trapped. He had Confederates pushing on his company from two sides, so he decided he had to fight himself out of that location that he was in as best he could. And during this time, both John Burns was wounded 3 times. The general also lost sight of him because the general himself had been shot. Later on, it turns out that both John Burns and the general were left on the battlefield badly wounded, and the general lay there for 43 hours before there was enough time for the company to come back and collect the wounded and get them back to hospitals and get back to treatments. So Burns then told General Callis afterwards that his friends took him home, that the rebels had advanced right over him, walked right over him and into town when they captured that field. So that's an example of somebody who actually just wanted to get involved. The battle was at their doorstep, and he wanted to join in just for that one battle with his old flintlock rifle. One of the other stories that Doc tells is about how General Bragg got a horse. And these are Doc's words that I'm going to use here because this is Doc describing this. One of the old-time Virginia darkies living just outside of the picket line would always come and visit the camp of the 6th Wisconsin. And so frequent were his visits that he became quite a regular with the boys. His name was Ike Washington. And his master was actually in the Confederate Army. And now the soldiers were always alert for any kind of piece of information that they might glean from anybody that came and visited him. So they were interested in the fact that this Ike told them about this beautiful horse that his master had, as well as the fact that his master would come home once in a while, would sneak home just to check on his plantation. So one day, the regiment decided they were going to pay Ike a visit. And Doc was actually asked to accompany them. They were going to go visit him on this plantation just to scope out the grounds. And sure enough, it happened to be a time when Ike's master was there at the plantation, but he had gone to visit one of the neighbors. And he left his horse tied up in the woods behind his house so that it wouldn't accidentally be discovered by someone and have it stolen. So the company, after visiting with Ike and appealing to him, they found the horse was hiding in a clump of woods nearby, and that the man, Ike's master, was at a neighbor's house. So, not delaying, after leaving a canteen with Ike, they made a detour in the woods and found this fine white mare, Kentucky bred, and of course they have to say, it just followed us off and back into camp. And so they gave the horse to General Bragg and entered him in the different Thanksgiving's Day races that they had. They had their own entertainment besides card games, playing games. They would have races. So they ended up taking this horse back and giving him to General Bragg. Doc also talks about another horse that General Bragg owned. And he says, at one time in front of Fredericksburg, while we were there in winter quarters, I remember a gray horse entered as Charles Bragg, and the general put up lots of cash on his Charlie, and he was a winner, too. So Doc remembers that the horse was brought home to Wisconsin, and the last that was heard of him, he was in Boynton and Company's stable in Milwaukee, together with the other blooded mare, the white mare from Kentucky, that they had gotten from Ike. So General Bragg must have collected a few nice horses during his time. One of the other stories that Doc mentions among all his stories is one time when the Iron Brigade was in line, and he even mentions the name of the guy's mansion, Arthur Bernhard's fine mansion. The men were very wearied by their day's toil and were deep asleep when they heard approaching what sounded like a cavalry. And that really woke everybody up. They could hear horses approaching. They didn't know if it was friend or enemy, but then they finally determined it was another Union line. And then to their amazement, discovered there wasn't a single weapon, not a saber or a gun in this. It was a brass band. And they halted very near to them. And then when they got orders, it was to camp within about 100 feet of the Confederate picket line. What was amazing is they figured that the Confederates could see that there wasn't any weapon, so 100 feet from their picket line, they didn't view them as a threat. And suddenly, in the middle of the night, the whole company was disturbed not by a midnight attack, but by the magic strains of enchanting music as the Star-Spangled Banner sounded in the air, at first like the distant tones of an organ, then gradually swelling until the last part seemed to thunder the words, "The Star-Spangled Banner, O long may it wave, o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave." On both sides, the sleeping soldiers were aroused and filled with conflicting emotions, to say the least. They listened eagerly until the end. Then Doc adds the sentence, 10,000 men heard it for the last time. They met their fate in a deadly charge the next day. That big of a number, when he talks about 10,000 men, I can only think that that had to be just before Gettysburg, because that's where the biggest loss of life was. Doc also then gave a toll of what the war cost the Iron Brigade. He actually kept tally of the number of miles they walked each year and the casualties. So you can see that listed here, how many deaths, how many wounded, how many were missing or mustered out. After the war, Doc settled in Milwaukee. He followed the Iron Brigade to Wisconsin. And And he was always a faithful participant of the GAR encampments that were held all over the country. About 20 years after the war ended, they started having these encampments so the old soldiers could talk about the good old days and remember what happened in the war. And one year, in 1881, the GAR encampment was held in Milwaukee. And at that time, Doc's daughter, Hattie, presented to the GAR a pennant that she had created for the GAR. And this is part of her speech that she gave to the convention about her dad. From the day I was old enough to understand anything, I was taught to respect and honor the Iron Brigade. He, meaning her father, Doc, went with you from Arlington to Fredericksburg, from there to Culpeper, back to Washington, then to South Mountain and Antietam, thence to Belle Plaine Landing, Chancellorsville, and Gettysburg, and was always ready to supply you with the latest news. He was captured and taken to Libby Prison, but returned to his first love, the dear old Iron Brigade, and furnished you with the Washington, New York, Philadelphia, and Baltimore papers. None of you love the old Iron Brigade or talk more about it than my papa. Here's a picture of his daughter holding one of the GAR flags. This is not the pennant that she made, but it is one of the flags that the GAR had made. And at one of the first GAR conventions, they made Doc Aubery and his daughter honorary members of the Iron Brigade. Because remember, Doc wasn't a soldier. He wasn't allowed to enlist. He was just a camp follower. So he never got a pension or anything for any military service, but he went through the entire war. So they made him an honorary member of the Iron Brigade. And the pennant that Hattie made, you can see at the Veterans Museum down in Madison. They have the original. What I have here also is at the Milwaukee Encampment, every attendee of the GAR encampment in Milwaukee got a souvenir bottle from Pabst Brewing Company of Milwaukee. And here's a picture of one of those. It stands about 5 inches high. It was corked and wired. That's how they sealed the bottles in those days. And you can barely see it here, but it was actually hand painted. And this bottle supposedly still has original contents. And here is a photograph of one of the encampments. I do not know if this is the Milwaukee one, but you can see in the lower left-hand corner, there's one guy sitting with newspapers on his arm. So there's Doc at this encampment. And up by the pillars, you can see the pennant that Hattie made for the Iron Brigade that she presented to them. One time during one of the GAR conventions, and it could have been the one in Milwaukee, there was a Mr. Spellman and a Sergeant Smith from a Virginia cavalry who were attending this encampment, GAR. And they were the ones who were doing picket duty in November '62 under Jeb Stuart when they captured a young newsboy as a prisoner of war. It so happened that those two gentlemen were at a GAR encampment by invitation and entertained the boys in blue. Doc himself was registered at a hotel, and just before the GAR parade, a corporal with a guard was ordered to go to Doc's hotel and place him under arrest. When the parade started, Doc was placed between these same two Confederate gentlemen who later revealed to him that they were his original captors, which he was not aware of. To say Doc was surprised was not really a name for it. They, of course, then said to him, Doc, this is the second time you have been captured by Jeb Stuart's cavalry, And we will have our photograph taken as a reminder of those times that tried men's souls. So the picture on the left is a picture of Doc. You'll see he's got a newspaper over his arm, and his two original captors who sent him off to Libby prison. So after the war, Doc settled in Milwaukee, where he was a night watchman for about 25 years in Milwaukee. He was hired by different companies as a night watchman and worked out of the police department. And he wrote a book about these experiences, 25 years on the streets of Milwaukee after dark. One of the things that Doc collected after the war, he wrote to everybody and anybody he could think of, asked them for mementos of the war. Many of them sent photographs. These are not tintypes. Some of them are tintypes, but some of them are just the cardavist cards, the small pictures about the size of a playing card. So these are just some of the pictures that Doc collected from some of the lieutenants, some of the colonels, some of the generals. He would write to anybody and everybody. So these are just simply some of the soldiers. But what struck me as unusual is there are two different photos of this one guy called Seth Kinman, California Hunter. And this guy is not in any kind of a uniform. He's just in buckskin clothes. He's got what looks like a coonskin cap on, an old flintlock gun. And so, of course, I had to find out who is this Seth Kinman and why does Doc have his photos in his collection. So I discovered that Seth was a hunter, trapper, Indian fighter, pioneer, craftsman, musician, saloon and hotel proprietor, or that's how he's described. And he was famous for his handcrafted elk horn chairs and grizzly bear chairs, all given to United States presidents, including James Buchanan, Abraham Lincoln, Andrew Johnson, and Rutherford B. Hayes. Anywhere from 57 to 1876, he would bestow one of his handcrafted chairs on a US president. So the fact that Doc had several of his pictures could very well indicate that perhaps Seth Kinman was in D.C., Washington, D.C., giving one of his chairs to Lincoln and obviously presenting and handing out his cards. And so Doc always took every opportunity to go. If there was a sight to see, Doc went. Because he was, once again, free to come and go as he pleased. He didn't need to get a pass or anything. He wasn't a soldier. He was just a camp follower. It says that Seth stood 6 foot tall, weighed about 200 pounds. He claimed to have killed 50 elk in 1 month, 240 in less than 1 year, and he claimed to have killed 800 grizzly bears in his lifetime. But then we have karma. Early in 1888, he accidentally shot himself below the knee of one leg, and the limb had to be amputated, and then he died from complications of the amputation. So Seth, and they had to note that Seth was buried in his buckskin clothes. So that's one of the other characters that Doc would come across in his collecting after the war was over. He has a photograph of Abraham Lincoln and members of a cabinet in one picture. One of his other pictures is also quite an education when you research this photo. It's a picture of Lincoln and all of the commanders that were part of the Civil War. But this, nowadays, in today's day, we would call this a fake picture, because there never was a time when Lincoln was together with all of his commanders, with all of his generals and his admiral. Actually, this picture was created, a montage was created by Travelers Life and Accident Company for advertising purposes. So what they had someone do is they took individual pictures of all these generals and the one admiral and of Lincoln, and then they pasted these pictures on this background picture. They also did the same with Robert E. Lee and all of his Confederate generals. They made these pictures up and they then sent them to their insurance agents to give out free to attract business. Some of Doc Aubery's Civil War collection, he collected rifles, guns, bullet pouches, you name it, he collected it. And his collection, which used to be housed in the old Carnegie Library here in Fond du Lac, is now in the Blakely Museum at the Historical Society. Here you can see one of the display cases that we have in the Blakely Museum that shows parts of his collection. The picture that's hanging on the wall in this display case is a picture of his daughter with the pennant that she made for the GAR. In this display case, right in the center, it's really hard to see because of the reflection from the lights, but there even is a tree trunk with a cannon embedded in it. A cannonball is embedded in the tree trunk. So that's some of the things that you can find that were part of his collection. Doc Aubery died Sunday, February 2nd, 1908, at his home in Milwaukee, and he's buried in Forest Home Cemetery in Milwaukee. So even though he wasn't born in Wisconsin, he really attached himself to the Iron Brigade, and they embraced him with open arms and made him part of Wisconsin's Iron Brigade. So if you have any other questions, want any other information, you can see his collection at the Historical Society in the Blakely Museum. We're going to be reopening on May 29th, our grand opening. And if you have any questions, you can go to our website, fdlhistory.com. And if you go to the library page, there's a form where you can actually fill in your question, send it off if you have a question about anything about Fond du Lac history, and those questions come directly to me, and I try to answer them as soon as I can. So you're welcome to submit your questions about Fond du Lac history that way. So once again, thank you very much, and I hope you enjoyed this presentation about Doc Aubery.